is Hound Dog Steve coming to you on the 14th of April. And whilst we've all been distracted by Brexit, the Yellow Vest protests have continued week after week. And of course now they're spreading to England. And that will be the topic of the conversation this evening. Well, a very warm welcome to all of you who are returning to my channel, and a big shout out for all of your first time visitors. And please, all of you, like, comment and subscribe below. It really does help when you do that. And thank you for joining the conversation. Okay, so the Yellow Vests have continued unabated. And as I said before, they will continue because just about everybody has reached the limit of their finances, and there is no possible way that anyone can increase their finances significantly enough to keep up with this creeping inflation. And of course, you know, we seem to be getting more and more charges from our government. This struck me the other day actually, because what's happening in our municipality, you know, is that we pay property taxes to pay staff to do work for us. If that's the case, then why do I need to buy a building permit? Isn't that covered in the cost of my property taxes? You know, this is a charge on a charge. You know, it's like you're just paying for these people to show up for work, not to actually do anything. What they do, you have to pay for as an extra. And so this has been a creeping form of inflation because you have to pay this. Okay, these people control the doorways. If you don't get a building permit, then you can't build. And so you have to buy the building permit. Now, of course, there are ways and means around this, and that's why I've been advocating for a Crown land patent on your property, which means you don't need to get a building permit, as long as you stay within the bounds of safety, that is. But I digress. So what has happened really over the last 40 or 50 years, as inflation has marched forward, every single person has done what everybody does in these circumstances. You make allowances and you keep making adjustments all the way along this path. So when I was growing up, for example, my mum never worked. My dad, we lived off my dad's wage, and you know, we bought a house on that wage and paid all of the bills, no problem at all. But when I was around about 7 or 8, my mum had to get a part-time job. By the time I was 14, she needed to work full-time. And of course, by the time I was 18, they were frequently using revolving credit to be able to make up for the shortfalls between their income and necessities. And so this is what people have done. They basically used every avenue that they have to try and compensate for inflation, and now they're not actually talking about having their hand in the fire. Their hand is in the fire, and that is why these protests will continue, and they will become more insistent until they address the underlying problems. And of course this is the problem. Macron still keeps on referring to these people as thugs and terrorists and xenophobes and Islamophobes and homophobes. They have set the army on these people. The police have unleashed these flashballs. They've been using, you know, sub-lethal weapons on their own people, and you'll see from the clips that I've chosen that these are just ordinary people who are walking the streets, and this is absolutely unconscionable, but it shows again the attitude towards the general public and the lack of understanding of what is actually going on here. Okay, so let's flip over to these clips and we'll come back and I will do a quick wrap up. Okay, here we go. Okay, this is from RT. Chaotic scenes as police battle protesters in Yellow Vest capital Toulouse on Act 22. Sporadic clashes broke out in the French southern city of Toulouse on Saturday as it was declared the capital of Yellow Vest Gilets Jaunes protests that day. Footage filmed by video agency Rupley shows people running in panic through thick clouds of smoke and tear gas filling the streets. So you can see by and large these are just ordinary people. Yeah, these are the real terrorists, all right, aren't they? Huh? Yellow Vest Act 22 clashes in Toulouse, Vikings in Paris. Now, I don't know about you, but all I saw was ordinary people. Marches in Paris and elsewhere were largely peaceful. Still, police arrested 15 people in the French capital, RFI reported. According to French authorities, some 31,000 protesters took part in the Yellow Vest rallies across France, including about 2,000 in Toulouse. And this from a French publication called The Local. What to expect from Act 22 of the Yellow Vest protests in France this weekend. The Yellow Vests are set to take to the streets of several French cities once again this weekend, but will the Saudi demonstrations see a large turnout, or has the movement more or less fizzled out? The number of protesters dropped to the lowest since the beginning of the movement's last weekend. However, more demonstrations are planned throughout April, according to the leading members of the anti-government group. This weekend will be the first time a Yellow Vest Act has taken place since the so-called Anti-Rioters Bill came into effect on Thursday, and the bill, which was approved by lawmakers in February, aims to crack down on violence that has marred the Yellow Vest protest movement. And of course there are protests going on all over France. Here is one in Dunkirk on Friday, parts of Lyon. Yellow vests from all over the east of France have been called on to protest in the eastern city of Strasbourg. And again from the Local, Yellow vests, France set to bring in controversial anti-rioting bill. French MPs have started debating a controversial anti-rioting bill which aims to crack down on the sort of street violence that has marred Yellow Vest anti-government protests since November. The bill notably aims to ban individuals identified as habitual hooligans from taking part in demonstrations and force protesters involved in acts of violence to pay for the damage. Some MPs also want more severe penalties for organisers of unauthorised demonstrations, as well as people who cover their faces during violent protests. But the bill has drawn fire, even within President Emmanuel Macron's own centrist party, from critics who say proposals represent a threat to civil liberties. Announcing the draft law earlier this month, Prime Minister Edouard Philippe said some of the anti-Macron Yellow Vest protests had led to unacceptable violence. The protests began in November against rising fuel taxes, but quickly spiraled into a wider revolt over accusations that Macron, a former banker, is out of touch with ordinary people in small-town and rural France. And from the Express, Macron branded Pyromaniac firefighter as Conservative politician welcomes anti-riot bill. French Conservative Eric Ciotti has welcomed Parliament's approval of a new anti-rioting bill to crack down on Yellow Vest violence, but stressed that President Emmanuel Macron's authoritarian tendencies and provocative street talk had fueled the unrest. M. Ciotti from the opposition, Les Républicains party, said that right-wingers had denounced the Macron illusion from the very beginning. And here he is in the Élysée Palace, just working Louis the 16th sat, before he was beheaded. He told the news channel BFM TV that Macron had put the country to fire and blood because of his continuous provocations, his abuses and the abuses of his entourage. He has behaved like a pyromaniac firefighter. He has tried putting out the Yellow Vest fire with a Canadair firefighting aircraft loaded with fuel. His policies are unjust and totally ineffective. The anti-violence bill, which was approved earlier on Tuesday by Parliament's lower house by 387 votes to 92, gives security forces the power to ban suspected troublemakers from joining street rallies without approval from a judge in a controversial bid to quell the citizen revolt. And this from Zero Hedge. London's Uber cab drivers catch yellow vest bug, rail against fossil fuel taxes. Also known as the Yellow Vest movement, the Gilets Jaunes movement in France gets a lot of hate from the left-leaning media. To critics, climate change requires government action, and if that means the working class will have to endure more poverty and misery, that is just how it is. But as the Gilets Jaunes message spreads far and wide, the sentiment against fossil fuel taxes is becoming the strongest in neighbouring England. As a new environmental policy goes into effect this month, cab and Uber drivers protest, claiming that charges associated with the new rules will cut their earnings in a meaningful way. The new rules, which are collectively known as the ultra-low emissions zone, go into effect starting April 8th, forcing drivers of older vehicles to pay a £12 charge to drive inside the northern and southern circular roads in London during peak hours. To Uber drivers, this could mean £90 a week in charges, wiping out a major chunk of their earnings. While the new policy does not apply to clean cars such as hybrid or electric vehicles, older models are vulnerable, and which drivers are impacted the most as a result? Those who cannot afford to purchase newer cars. In other words, this tax isn't the solution to climate change, it is only a way to make the poor poorer. Unfortunately for the environmentalist plan, those impacted the most are not going to go down without a fight. And this is what I have said exactly. People are up against the wall. And as we saw, these protests are now spreading to England. I know it's a kind of a different thing, but it's still an environmental tax, and it's going to affect a lot of commerce, and that commerce is going to pass on to the general public those increases. So nobody escapes. This is just playing pass the parcel and hoping it doesn't explode on your watch. And all of the banks and all of the politicians and all of the elitists and all of the really, really, really rich folk are playing this game with our lives. Anyway, I'm not quite sure whether this is deliberate or whether these people have just fallen asleep at the switch and haven't realized all of this building tension. And I suspect that's what it is. When you live in a bubble, when you're insulated against the real effects of life, the real effects of inflation, then you don't feel the same kind of pain that somebody like myself does, when they go to the pumps and you fill up your tank with gas or diesel, and you're paying an extra $2-3 per tankful. Now thankfully I don't have to do a lot of driving because I live quite close to work, but there are many, 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 many people who have moved out into the rural areas, into these smaller villages and towns, because the real estate was a lot cheaper, it was more manageable. And this is the way young families, could start off and, raise their family, have children and this kind of thing. But it meant that one or both had to drive from that location into the city to work. And so, again, you add this extra burden on. The food is going to go up. I seriously think that when you increase, say, 5 cents a litre, which we just had that in Ontario, 5 cents a litre. Okay, for you and I, we're going to pay 7 times that. Because approximately there are 7 people in between everything that we buy. Everything that we use, every contact that we make. When you go and buy your groceries, there is the grocery store owner, there is the people who work there, there is the driver that drove the vegetables there is the driver that drove from the farm to the terminal, there is the farmer, and there is the person who drove all the supplies to the farm. All of these people, they have to get their increase. Okay, and all that is passed on to you and I, and that's why these carbon taxes are so regressive, and they come at a time when people are already having real difficulties in their lives with financing. A lot of debt has caught up with people, and like I say, that they've used every option that they possibly can to ameliorate the situation, and so now their hand is literally in the economic fire. And when your hand is in the fire, I can tell you, you only have one thing on your mind, and that is to get your hand out of that fire. And we're in a no-win situation. They can't increase their income. They're working every hour that God sent because they have to drive to and from. There's a commute plus an 8-hour workday. So you may be looking at 10 hours to 12 hours per day, depending on how far you have to commute. And then you have to sleep, say 6 hours. Well, there's 18 hours. That leaves you just 6 hours left to do everything else with your life. So people can't take on another part-time job. Maybe their kids are too young to take on a job or something to try and supplement. People have payments. Insurance is going up by leaps and bounds. Everything around us is going up like crazy. And of course, as this continues, more and more and more people are being pushed over the edge, and that's when that day of reckoning is coming. So I would plan accordingly. Take care of that debt. Try not to get into too much debt. Do not take out lines of credit on your home. This is a big, big mistake, and to live within your means. I don't like to brag, but I live very modestly. I may be making YouTube videos in my office here, but I live in a 950 square foot home, and it is very, very easy to heat and to maintain. And that's kind of what we're all going to be doing, folks, if we're going to survive this absolute economic Armageddon that's going to take place as people just meet that brick wall. Okie dokie, if you have enjoyed this video, please like, comment and subscribe below. And in the meantime, this is Hound Dog Steve signing off, wishing you a great week coming up, and we will talk very, very soon. Okay, see you now. Bye.